Good evening, I'm Jim Lara. On the NewsHour tonight, the renomination of Alan Greenspan +2 as seen by two economists. A debate over some of the economic nerves Pat Buchanan has touched. The testimony of top White House aide Harold Ickes before the Senate Whitewater Committee, and the All-American Skin Game. David Gergen talks with author Stanley Crouch. It all follows our summary of the news this Thursday.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer has been provided by the Archer Daniels Midland Company, ADM, supermarket to the world. And by New York Life, yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
President Clinton today renominated Alan Greenspan as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Mr. Clinton also named his budget director, Alice Rivlin, to be vice chairman of the Fed, and economist Lawrence Meyer of Washington University in St. Louis to a vacant seat on the board. At a White House ceremony, the president introduced the new nominees and offered high praise for Greenspan.
He brings his years of experience as a prominent economist, and I might add, a leading Republican, and a career capped by 8 years of service as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. During his tenure, he has inspired confidence, and for good reason. He has worked with our administration to safeguard the stability of global financial markets, recognizing that today even temporary difficulties in one corner of the globe can have far-reaching effects in another. And more importantly, his decisions have helped us to work toward a period of sustained economic growth.
All three nominations are subject to confirmation by the Republican-controlled Senate. We'll have more on this story right after the news summary. The U.S. Navy temporarily grounded its F-14 fighter jets after another one crashed today in the Persian Gulf. The two crewmen were rescued. They had only minor injuries, but this is the third F-14 crash in less than a month from a San Diego-based squadron. Pentagon spokesman Kenneth Bacon explained what the Navy calls a stand-down order.
We do not know what has caused these three crashes this year with the F-14s. The goal of the stand-down is to make everybody take some time out to look at everything in connection with flying F-14s, training, maintenance, equipment, etc., to see if we can find any common threads. And if we knew what the problem was, as you do know during a grounding, we would take the specific action required to correct it. The Navy does not know, and it wants to find out.
There are 337 F-14s in the U.S. fleet. With a few exceptions, they will not fly during the next 3 days while Navy engineering and safety experts review the recent crashes. On Whitewater today, Senate Committee Chairman Alphonse D'Amato criticized White House staff for delaying the handover of documents to his committee. A new batch of documents sought since October was turned over Tuesday night. These concerned meetings by White House staff in 1994 on how to handle the Whitewater affair. Today, President Clinton's Deputy Chief of Staff, Harold Ickes, answered questions about them. We'll have excerpts from his testimony later in the program. At another Senate hearing today, CIA Director John Deutch said he would use American journalists as intelligence agents only under very special circumstances. He said so in an appearance before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Chairman Arlen Specter asked Deutch about such a policy.
Our general rule is we do not use American journalists, we do not use American news organizations. That is our general policy. It is only in very rare circumstances that we would consider exceptions when there are particular situations which involve risk to American lives or particular questions of absolute access on matters of important or critical national security matters. We would not do it as a matter of policy in general to gain foreign intelligence.
Deutch said he sympathized with journalists who fear the integrity of their profession will be called into question. The shuttle Columbia was launched into space today from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Its 7-member crew is off on a 14-day mission. They will deploy and retrieve an Italian satellite tethered to the shuttle by a 12-mile-long cord. Scientists will try to generate electricity as the ball-shaped satellite and tether are pulled through space. An attempt to conduct the same experiment in 1992 failed when the cord would not extend its full length. In Moscow today, the director of the International Monetary Fund agreed to lend Russia $10.2 billion. Payments would start in mid-spring. In exchange, the Russian government committed to a program of rigorous economic reforms. In Bosnia today, Bosnian President Izetbegovic was hospitalized in Sarajevo with heart problems. A senior aide said his condition was not life-threatening, but Bosnia's collective presidency convened an emergency session to decide who would temporarily assume his duties. Elsewhere in the capital, Serbs continued their exodus before the city comes under joint Muslim-Croat control next month. Last night, departing residents set fires in a Serb suburb. Several homes, a supermarket, and a factory were destroyed. A State Department spokesman said today the United States has settled a lawsuit with Iran over the downing of an airplane in the Persian Gulf. An American warship accidentally shot down the Iranian passenger jet in 1988. All 290 people on board were killed. The U.S. will pay an average of $300,000 directly to each victim's family. No money will go to the Iranian government. Back in this country, firefighters worked to contain a large grass fire near Fort Worth, Texas. Other fires spread across the state, fanned by high temperatures and drought. Governor George Bush asked for a federal disaster declaration for the entire state. The largest fire has burned more than 25,000 acres in and around the town of Poolville. Dozens of homes were destroyed. At least 18 people were injured. And that's it for the news summary tonight. Now it's on to the Federal Reserve nominations, a debate about Pat Buchanan's economics, the Senate Whitewater hearings, and a David Gergen dialogue. President Clinton's renomination of Chairman Alan Greenspan and two others to the Federal Reserve Board is where we begin tonight. Elizabeth Farnsworth has the story.
Besides Alan Greenspan, who was nominated to a third term, the president also nominated his budget director, Alice Rivlin, as the vice chair of the board. And he nominated economist Lawrence Meyer of Washington University at St. Louis to the board. To discuss the nominations and what they mean for the economy, we have in Boston Alan Sinai, the chief global economist for Lehman Brothers. We are also joined from Austin, Texas by James Galbraith, an economics professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Sinai, do you think the re-nomination of Alan Greenspan was the right thing to do?
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. Greenspan has done a terrific job, very fine job, and he is respected worldwide as well as domestically. There never was any question he'd be reappointed, I think.
And James Galbraith, do you agree?
Well, the president made 3 appointments to the Federal Reserve Board today. I have a very, very high regard for Alice Rivlin. Lawrence Meyer I know by reputation. But I think in the case of Alan Greenspan, he would have done better, the president would have done better to name someone who was more committed to a higher rate of economic growth, reduction of unemployment, and I think that it's unfortunate that he didn't take that opportunity.
The president is committed to those things. Why do you think he didn't take that opportunity?
Well, I can't speak for the president's reasoning, but I do think that if you look back at Chairman Greenspan's record, it is one of systematically overestimating the risk of inflation in this economy, raising interest rates when it was not necessary to do so, particularly in a period beginning in early 1994 and going on up to the middle of last year, doing a great deal of damage to the prospects for growth and to the general welfare, particularly of middle-class Americans. And I think that we're in a period now in which people really are looking to our national leadership to address those concerns. And I'm afraid that with Alan Greenspan's reappointment, we're seeing that they will not be as addressed as effectively as they might be.
Okay, I'll come back to that debate in a minute. We want to talk about that. But first, what about the other 2 appointments? You mentioned it, what you thought about them, Mr. Galbraith. What do you think, Mr. Sinai, of the appointment of Alice Rivlin and Lawrence Meyer?
Well,
what do you think they'll bring?
Excellent.
What might they change?
Well, first of all, they're excellent appointments. The professional qualifications and experience of both are impeccable. I do think they will be more on the pro-growth mode that President Clinton is looking for, and will tilt the Federal Reserve more in the direction of a higher propensity for more growth with lower interest rates. And and perhaps address some of the criticisms that Mr. Galbraith is levying against Mr. Greenspan.
And before we get into the criticisms, Mr. Galbraith, do you have anything else to say about the two new appointments?
No, I think they're both, I know Alice Rivlin quite well, and I think she's a fine appointment. As I say, I know Mr. Meyer by reputation. I agree with Alan Sinai that these appointments will move the Federal Reserve in the right direction. I just hoped it would be moved further and more quickly.
Now, you have begun to lay out the debate that has been in the papers and in lots of different places in recent weeks about what the Fed should be doing. Could you do this, you've started it, in a way that the non-economist, which most of us were not mostly economists in the audience, can understand? The President has said he wants more of a debate inside the Fed about pro-growth policies. The idea is that the Fed has been too restrictive in its monetary policy, or at least that's one view. Could you describe that argument, and then we'll go to Mr. Sinai and talk to him about it too.
Well, Federal Reserve policy is the single most powerful force acting on our economy. It determines, helps determine whether the stock market goes up or down. It helps determine whether growth and employment go up or down. And in recent years, I believe that the Federal Reserve has been much too worried about the threat of inflation when, in fact, no such threat really existed, and the Federal Reserve itself had no evidence that any such threat existed. So we would see a reaction against a phantom threat of inflation by raising interest rates and slowing the economy. At the same time, on the other side, we've seen very little response to the fact that we still have in the order of 7 million unemployed, 5.8% unemployment, that we have a growth rate which is right now slowing down. I can't predict the future, but I think that we're in a situation which could become dangerous later on this year. And I think that the Federal Reserve should have been more worried about slow growth and unemployment, less worried about essentially non-existent threat of inflation. They've been conducting a policy which has been biased against growth, and that's, it seems to me, is a mistake.
Mr. Sinai, what do you think about that?
Well, I think Professor Galbraith really misses the nub of the contribution of the Greenspan Fed, which is so revolutionary, and why I give Chairman Greenspan some of the highest marks in history. It is the forward-looking and preemptive approach of a central bank in dealing with what ultimately drives our economy into recession, too much inflation. And the lags in that process are such that the central bank, if it does it right, has to act in advance of the obvious presence of the problem in order to prevent the problem from occurring. It's like taking preventive medicine. And this was very different. This was in 1994, a very, very tough period of rising interest rates with a lot of trouble for all of us, including myself, firms all around the world. This was one of the reasons, perhaps the primary one, why today we are entering the 6th year of this business expansion without a threat of accelerating inflation, and why we now can legitimately debate the issue and move toward somewhat more pro-growth actions without worrying about accelerating inflation. Fighting and preventing inflation from picking up when the economy was getting close to full employment in 1994 and at an unsustainable growth rate had to be done to get to where we are today, so we can go ahead now and fashion more pro-growth policies, which, by the way, I favor. We can grow faster we can grow faster in an inflation-safe way now because of these preemptive actions that Professor Galbraith obviously doesn't understand.
Mr.
Well,
Sinai,
let me
go ahead.
respond on that.
Yes, go
I'm
ahead.
a very close student of what the Federal Reserve says officially to Congress. And in 1994, when they raised interest rates, they did not say that they were facing a threat of higher inflation. In fact, Chairman Greenspan himself explicitly said the contrary. He said that inflation was under control, that inflation expectations were coming down as a result of the deficit reduction policies that had been put into effect in 1993. So when pressed in 1994 as to why he was raising interest rates, he did not make the anti-inflationary argument that Mr. Sinai attributes to him in retrospect.
Mr. Galbraith, let me interrupt you. I want to bring this up to, we have very few minutes left, and I want to bring this right up to the present. This relates very much to the current fears that people have about the economy. The Fed's policy Can you explain that, please? I mean, what the debate is about right now, whether or not people's incomes are rising rapidly, people being laid off.
That's right. We have not seen rising wages in this country for well on 20 years. We have not seen an improvement in living standards. We have tremendous anti-inflationary forces that affect our economy now that did not affect it 10 and 15 years ago. They come from foreign trade, they come from the low cost of imports, they come from competition in the labor market. We are much less prone to inflation now than we used to be. So while Mr. Sinai says the Federal Reserve has looked to the future, I say it has missed the boat on the present. It is fighting the last war, and it is not giving the American public the opportunity to have a higher standard of life that many people want and I think they deserve and that the economy can safely produce. That's the problem with the current policy.
Mr. Sinai, what about that argument that current technological changes and other factors have made it possible to have growth without inflation and that the Fed hasn't recognized this?
I think the Fed is looking at that, has been looking at that. Any central bank anywhere has to worry very much about keeping inflation down.
I'm going to...
I think, though,
there
Professor,
you are,
I watch the Federal Reserve read every comment. I do that for a living in 1994, every day, every minute of the day, and I must say that he hasn't read the record correctly. And if you read the statements of ex-Vice Chairman Blinder as well as Chairman Greenspan, it's very clear that they were preemptively attacking inflation before it showed up in the hope of sustaining the business expansion. That is almost a universally held opinion by students of what the Federal Reserve did at that time. He simply is wrong. He's not at all in touch with the record. And the second thing is his comment about wages. There's only one statistic, average hourly earnings, that shows the kind of behavior that he has attributed. There's no doubt American workers are squeezed. It's been a tough time. We have grown slowly on average. Inflation is lower as a result. The unemployment rate isn't that high, actually. It's many people think it is essentially at full employment. I don't, but many people do. But the American workers are feeling squeezed because they're working very hard to make a living, and that we do have to address as a nation and take care of over the next 4 years.
Well, Alan Sinai and James Galbraith, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, Buchanan's economics, the Senate Whitewater hearings, and a David Gergen dialogue. Now a look at some of the economic nerves the Buchanan campaign has touched. Our economics correspondent Paul Salmon of WGBH Boston is in charge.
Among the key points in Pat Buchanan's economic platform is the support of protectionism and a rejection of free trade, and such recent agreements as the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Republican President George Bush heavily promoted NAFTA, and in the summer of 1992 announced the completion of negotiations.
This historic trade agreement will further open markets in Mexico, Canada, and the United States, and it'll create jobs and generate economic growth in all three countries. Open markets in Mexico and Canada mean more American jobs.
Less than a year later, it was a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, who lobbied Congress hard for NAFTA's passage. The Democratic president echoed what had become a post-World War II consensus, emphasizing the bipartisan nature of the support for free trade.
Why are we so willing to say no to partisan politics and yes to NAFTA? I think it is because we know, as all of these have said in different ways, that NAFTA reflects this moment's expression of all the lessons we have learned in the 20th century.
Though many rank-and-file Democrats, especially in the labor movement, opposed the free trade push, Clinton persisted and, with support from a Republican Congress, got America to sign the latest version of the global free trade agreement known as the GATT. Among other things, it created a new World Trade Organization.
We have moved one step closer toward gaining broad bipartisan support for GATT. I'm pleased to announce that an understanding has been reached with Senator Dole to reaffirm our United States sovereignty and to make sure that the reaffirmation will be protected in the GATT process. That means that the WTO will be accountable and fair and will meet our expectations.
Meanwhile, and ever since, throughout America, economic insecurity has, if anything, grown as trade barriers have shrunk. And that seems to have provided the opening for what's being called Buchanomics, Pat Buchanan's economic program, with its rejection of free trade.
It is the cause of a brand new, bold conservatism in American politics. A conservatism, the conservatism that looks out for the men and women of this country whose jobs have been sacrificed on the altars of trade deals done for the benefit of transnational corporations who have no loyalty to our country and no loyalty to anybody.
Okay, now joining us to discuss the economic angst that Pat Buchanan has tapped are four experts. Jeffrey Garten, the Dean of the Yale School of Management. He served in the Clinton administration as the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. Carla Hills was the U.S. Trade Representative for the Bush administration. Alan Tonelson is a research fellow with the United States Business and Industrial Council Educational Foundation. And Thea Lee specializes in international trade at the Economic Policy Institute. And welcome to you all. Now, Mr. Tonelson, what's the argument in favor of Pat Buchanan's economic position?
The argument in favor is that we unfortunately live in a world economy that is a lawless jungle where power, national power, remains the key to national success. As everybody on this panel knows, most of the rest of the world's governments are engaged in a staggering variety of practices whose purpose is to steal jobs, to steal income, to steal technology, to steal living standards from highly competitive American producers. And the choice that we face is basically between the business-as-usual style free trade policies that have been followed by the last two administrations, in fact, going back further than that, with disastrous results, $1.5 trillion of cumulative trade deficits since 1980, staggering job loss, and responding. And what Mr. Buchanan is tapping into is the common sense feeling out there among the American public that a much more vigorous, but also a much more intelligent response is needed by Washington.
And you agree with that?
I agree with the general thrust of it, absolutely.
Carla Hills, you're a longtime Republican. We saw you in one of those clips, actually. What's the essence of your argument against what Pat Buchanan and Mr. Tonelson are talking about?
We live in a global economy, and that is where we're creating the jobs. The best and the highest paying jobs are connected with international. About 12 million Americans owe their jobs to their international trade. We are a country of 5% of the world's population, and we produce a quarter of its output. More than 50% of our wheat, computers, aircraft, cotton are sold abroad. We can't consume it all. We need open markets, and we need the rule of law that the trade agreements give us. And if you look carefully at the trade agreements, they have worked, including the North American Free Trade Agreement that you mentioned. Even with Mexico's trouble, our exports are up 15%. And that is a very different outcome from the '82 debt crisis when Mexico raised its tariff and cut our exports to it by half. This time, our exports have maintained their status.
Well, we'll get to the evidence in a minute and maybe argue about it, but basically your argument is no choice. We have no choice. It's a world economy, that's it.
Absolutely.
Jeffrey Garten, you were a member of the Clinton administration, as we've said, and you are a professor of international trade at Yale. What are the traditional economic arguments for free trade against protectionism that we haven't yet heard from Ms. Hills?
Well, in an ideal world, trade would bring growth. It would bring more choice for consumers. It would keep prices down because of the competition. And it would create a lot of jobs. And I think, for the most part, all of that is happening. I'm somewhere between the first two people because I think that Mr. Buchanan is tapping into some very legitimate anxieties. On the other hand, I think that the policies he's advocating would be totally disastrous.
Okay, well, you certainly don't think it's an ideal world, do you, Ms. Lee? No. And you're generally considered to be on the left. You were opposed to NAFTA. What do you think Pat Buchanan's saying here? Do you think he's got a point? I guess that's the question.
I think he clearly has a point that our current trade policies aren't working to do what they're supposed to do, the most basic objective, which is to raise the living standards of the majority of Americans. And instead what they're doing is costing us good jobs, putting downward pressure on wages for working Americans, and also limiting our ability to make national policy in a way that that in a democratic process. And NAFTA, I think if you look at the results, has been a total fiasco. It didn't deliver the jobs for U.S. workers. It didn't deliver democracy or prosperity or stability in Mexico. It was a bad development policy and an even worse jobs policy.
Okay, I don't want. You want to quickly take on Mexico?
Yeah. Well, I just want to
second.
say that I think NAFTA was the right decision at the time. I think that the verdict over time will be that it is an excellent treaty, that we are much better off without it over a decade than we would have been with it than we would have been if there had been no treaty.
Okay, so I think we probably aren't going to slug out Mexico here or come to any conclusion about it, but let's get to some of the specifics here. Carla Hills, what's your reaction to Pat Buchanan's suggestion that basically we should get out of NAFTA and the GATT?
He'd be cutting off the best source of economic growth that we have, because if you just look at the Labor Department study that was recently completed, it shows that the fastest growing sector of our economy is in international, and it is the highest paying job. So that's the area that we want to encourage so that we do raise the standard of living for our people.
Okay, so it would kill growth. Now, Mr. Donaldson, what do you think?
Our trade policy is manifestly not contributing to higher living standards, quite the opposite. It is impossible for a trade policy that's racking up record merchandise trade deficits year after year to be contributing to economic growth and in fact and to higher living standards for most Americans. And in fact, the living standards for the great majority of citizens of this country have been going down for the last 20 years, not up. I don't see how in the world you can say trade policy has been a job-creating and living standard-boosting success.
Mr. Gardner gets in here for a second.
In 1990, about 8 million American jobs were associated with exports. By the end of this decade, it will be 16 to 18 million jobs.
But Jeff, imports exist too, and they're much higher, and they've been much higher for a long,
But you cannot
time.
associate imports with lack of jobs.
It's gotta
I think
work
one of
both
the
ways.
problems
Please,
here is that trade is not the entire panoply of economic policies. What trade has done has been beneficial, but there are a lot of other things that have to be done, such as a pro-growth policy.
So you say we're having trouble, but it's not trade's fault. That's the basic
I would
position.
agree with that. I would further say that you cannot take the statement that trade deficits are connected to unemployment, because if you look at the trade deficits that were in existence in after 1987, in fact, we crept up. We cut the deficit by 50% in the 5 years before 1987, and our unemployment plummeted from 10% to 6%. And after 1987, as our trade deficit went down, in fact, our jobs did not increase.
But the point is what's happened to the quality of those jobs, and that's really where you see the dramatic increase in inequality in wages for Americans, that some of the good jobs that we had, good blue-collar jobs, have been displaced in the manufacturing sector, and we've seen both a stagnation of the average wage and then an increase in the inequality of wages. So those new jobs are not good jobs. What we're doing is displacing manufacturing workers into the service sector where productivity growth is lower, and in fact that has slowed the growth.
That's why I said living standards, not jobs.
So you guys, wait just a second, you guys think that trade is the culprit. You guys think that trade isn't the culprit. Everybody agrees there's
Trade
a
is
problem.
one
Entirely, it's not helping.
It's not helping.
Clearly.
Well, but you were blaming it, weren't you?
It
Not
probably
just not
hurting.
helping.
Probably
But
hurting.
I don't think anyone would say trade is the only problem in the U.S. economy, and that's the important part.
but it's a problem.
It is a contributing problem, and I think most economists actually agree with that now.
Well-
that trade has
Well, I don't think
contributed.
that's right.
No, that is true. That, I mean, even someone like Paul Krugman, who is a free trader, has said that trade is responsible for about 10% of the increase in inequality since 1980.
Well, there's a
There are
huge
differing
debate.
points
There's a
of view.
huge debate about that, and we could argue that point alone all night long. Mr. Garton, what about Buchanan's proposal? I want to get back to the specifics here. Buchanan has a proposal to slap a 10% tariff on Japanese goods, and I've seen estimates of 20 to 40% tariff on China because we have such a negative balance of trade with them. What would happen if those policies went into effect?
Well, let's just set aside the fact that it's totally unworkable, because selective tariffs would only mean those products would come in from some other country being transshipped.
Transshipped mean they'd
just
send it to
come through.
Thailand and then it
That's
would
right.
come in from
But let's just talk about the tariffs. That's a great way to raise prices for everybody in the United States. That's a great way to increase inflation. That's a great way to restrict the choice that consumers have. This is gunboat economics. This is going right back to the 19th century. It makes absolutely no sense. I'm not denying that there are problems and that there are real anxieties, but Buchanan's approach his proposed remedies are disastrous.
But Ms. Hills, even you supported or threatened Japan with retaliation. I mean, we have used techniques like this in the past, have we not, when we thought there was unfair competition?
The aim is to get the market open. And there are all kinds of ways to negotiate market opening because that is what creates greater opportunity and, in the long run, economic growth. I don't say trade is a panacea, but trade is creating more and better paying jobs than in the overall economy, and so that is a sector we want to nurture.
Do you support these tariffs, Ms. Lee, or tariffs like 10% on Japanese goods, 20, 40% on China?
I don't think it makes sense to do it by country necessarily, but I think possibly a temporary tariff in a certain industry where we're having trade problems would not be out of line, but it's a temporary solution. It's not the whole solution. I think the main thing that we need to do is to change the whole set of rules governing trade and investment. We need to put the interests of workers and protecting the environment right at the top of our trade negotiating agenda, not at the bottom where it's been in the past.
Okay, that leads us into this whole issue of insecurity. We heard about it earlier in the discussion about the Fed. So let's talk for a moment what's behind all this. Carla Hills, don't many people have really good reason to feel insecure about their economic future here in America?
Absolutely. There are a number of well-known corporations who had lifetime employment who have laid off not 50 workers but thousands of workers, and it has really created enormous anxiety. But the solution is not to cut off trade, which creates good jobs, but the solution is to have regulatory and tax reform that encourage job creation. What government can do is to create a climate so that business develops. If you look at smaller businesses, those with under 500 employees, they've created 8 million jobs in the last half decade. That's
and
incredible.
Most of them don't export.
That is absolutely incorrect.
Well,
incorrect.
I don't know the answer, so I can't adjudicate. But let's stay with insecurity for a second. Mr. Donaldson, everybody's insecure, right? I mean, do you agree with Ms. Hills on this point?
The people who are doing well at the top of the ladder are feeling very secure.
Yeah,
why shouldn't they?
Fair enough. Okay, and Ms. Lee?
Absolutely. The economic insecurity is real, and it's affecting the bottom, probably 75% of the American workforce.
And you blame trade, not the only culprit, but trade significantly. What do you blame for the economic insecurity, assuming you agree, too, that we have plenty of it?
We have plenty of it. I think that the American economy is going through a very dramatic transition. New industries are popping up. Everyone has to be much more competitive. And I think this is creating a new kind of workforce. And during that transition, a lot of people are going to be out of work or fear that they're going to be out of work. I think there are things that can be done.
Okay, so talk about some. Talk about them specifically, if you wouldn't mind, with regard to trade. I mean,
well, no, that's the problem. You see, that's the problem. Is that if you ask me what should we do in trade, it would be more of it. It would be promote exports even more aggressively than we do.
Because?
Because that is one of the single biggest forces for growth in the economy and one of the single biggest job creators. Let me come to the other things. As long as you just talk about trade, you've got it in such a narrow channel that there really isn't an issue as far as I'm concerned.
There isn't an issue for you mean?
Well, there aren't very many choices because the Buchanan-type choices would just backfire on everyone. But there are some things. For example, I do subscribe to the theory that we should have policies that produce faster growth. I think we are in a new world economy. I think the danger of inflation is much less than it was before, and I'd like to see the United States, in conjunction with the other major countries, stimulate more economic growth.
And maybe we saw that if Alice Rivlin is going to the Fed, there's a possibility that would happen.
And I think, secondly, there are huge opportunities in the area of training and retraining the American workforce. And incidentally, I don't think that's a government responsibility. I think the government can play some role, but here is an area where American business really should step up to the plate.
Okay, well, let's talk to somebody who disagrees with you about this. Ms. Lee, do you really think that trade policy can make a difference? That is, it can lower economic anxiety in this country?
I think it could. I think the right kind of trade policy that, for one thing, when we're running chronic trade deficits year after year, growing trade deficits, I think it's hard to say that we're generating a lot of great new jobs. I mean, it's true that export jobs are good jobs, but import competing jobs are also good jobs because they're also manufacturing jobs for the most part. But I think that, for one thing, that if we're not protecting labor and environmental standards in our trade policy, what we're doing is we're sending the wrong incentives both to U.S. companies and to our trading partners. What we're doing is we're rewarding the worst kind of behavior instead of the best kind of behavior. We reward the companies and the countries that deny workers the right to organize unions, that hire children, that trash the environment. And instead, if we built those rules, labor and environmental standards, minimum labor and environmental standards, into our trade policies, we would reward the countries and companies that perform best, not worst.
Do you expect Pat Buchanan will do that?
I don't know.
Pat Buchanan is not, I mean, what you say is, I subscribe to 100%. But I believe that's really at the margin of the kinds of problems that we have. Of course, we should have more rules on the environment and labor standards. But when we talk about the size of the trade, you know, at the beginning of this decade, about 12% of the American economy was involved in trade. By the end of the decade, it's going to be 25 to 30%. This is an economy that is such an international force that we can't turn back the clock. The issue is, how do we deal with the effects?
And precisely because of that, precisely because, as Ambassador Hill said, we're in a global economy to stay, we need to use international economic policy, including trade policy, to ensure that that global economy unfolds in ways favorable to American values and to American interests. If we lack the national power, if we strip ourselves of it, we'll never do it.
Do you think we could, you really think that we would be able, using trade policy, to lessen the anxiety and help solve the problems you guys are talking with, that everybody agrees to?
Using international economic policy, which includes policy on foreign investment, on promoting technology development. There's a wide variety of policy tools, not simply tariffs and quotas. It's not building walls. It is enabling the United States to have the economic strength we need to compete successfully.
But Pat Buchanan is talking about building walls, at least
no,
that's the rhetoric.
No, he's not talking about building walls. No, he's talking about
talking about literally building a wall, I thought, between Mexico and the U.S.
As you pointed out, the Clinton and Bush administrations both threatened other countries with severe tariffs in order to open markets. I don't understand what it is that Pat Buchanan's proposing that's so dramatically different from that.
Well,
Bill
he is
Clinton,
proposing the pull-up of the North American Free Trade Agreement.
which is a fantastic idea.
This is great.
Failure.
We got to go. Thank you all very much. We'll continue some other time.
Now today's hearings before the Senate Whitewater Committee. Kwame Holman reports.
The Senate Whitewater Committee received more than 100 pages of documents from the White House Tuesday night, documents it had subpoenaed months ago. This morning, Committee Chairman Alphonse D'Amato opened the hearings, making it clear he was not at all pleased with the cooperation shown by the Clinton administration.
I find it unacceptable to have a pattern which I can only describe as unacceptable, where the White House and its chief aides continue a pattern that is certainly contemptuous of good procedure, that borders on deliberate withholding of information, or at the very least, total and ineffectual efforts to attempt to be cooperative. It is one or the other.
The newly arrived documents are notes belonging to Deputy White House Chief of Staff Harold Ickes, the committee's lone witness today. Ickes took the notes during a 1994 meeting of a White House response team formed to handle press inquiries about President and Mrs. Clinton's Whitewater land investment in Arkansas and its connection to the failure of Madison Guaranty Savings and Loan of Little Rock.
There was no attempt whatsoever to hide anything, to keep anything back from this committee. I think if you look at the substance of those documents, there's nothing of critical importance in there. Obviously, this committee has a right to have those documents. I made a mistake, and I apologize to the committee for that. But the fact of the matter is this White House has made every attempt, exceeded by no White House in the history of the Republic, to cooperate with this committee, with House committees, with independent prosecutors. We have turned over 14-some thousand pages of documents, I'm told, to this committee alone. We've turned over 50 to 60,000 documents in total to various committees in the independent council. We are not hiding anything.
But the hearing was filled with heated exchanges as Republican counsel Michael Chertoff pressed Ickes about the Clintons' interest in investigations related to Whitewater.
Did you have discussions with the president
Business partner.
concerning the question of the possible exposure that the president and Mrs. Clinton might have with respect to an RTC investigation of the Rose Law Firm?
Well, are you reading from testimony that I've given, Mr. Chertoff?
No,
If so, I'd like to see it.
I'm asking you a question,
No,
Mr. Ickes.
are you reading from testimony, Mr. Chertoff? Because if you are,
Mr.
I would like to
Ickes,
see
Mr.
it.
Ickes, you don't ask the questions here, all right? We asked the questions. It would appear fairly obvious that Mr. Chertoff had to ask the question 2 or 3 times to get a response as it related to whether or not you communicated with the president with respect to Whitewater.
He
And
said-
then
he used
had
the
a
word- Mr.
Excuse me.
Mr. Chairman,
I
he used
will
the
make,
word
now, wait a
reported.
minute, Mr. Ickes. You may be deputy chief of the White House, and you give orders there, but we're going to try to be fair. We will be fair. But try to be responsive. Now, I'm going to ask...
I'm trying to do that, Mr. Chairman. I think I've testified before at least twice, if not 3 times, Mr. Chertoff, that I did have conversations. I wouldn't say they were about exposure, and I do not recall at what time I had those conversations, when I had those conversations, where I had those conversations, or whom was present.
Democratic counsel Richard Benveniste tried to defuse the matter by asking Ickes to review his notes taken during a meeting of the Whitewater response team.
Now I think the important thing is to see what is in the notes, look at that carefully, and get your best recollection about those events.
Well, one issue that was being discussed at that time was the release of documents. And as you recall, there had been a subpoena that had been negotiated between Mr. Kendall and the Department of Justice in late December of the preceding year. And I think the notes say here, release of documents on the advice of counsel and totally, probably should read total, but totally cooperation. And I take that to mean that there was that the discussion there was that there should be complete and total cooperation as had been promised by the President with respect to the release of documents. We should spend, I think as I read my handwriting, it should be we should speak. And the question there is who should speak and in what terms. A lot of people at the White House were talking about Whitewater at that time. Some were informed, some were misinformed. Quite frankly, we were getting hammered by the press because misinformation, not wittingly but inadvertently, was coming out of the White House. And one thing we wanted to do was to limit the number of people who were speaking about Whitewater so that, and when I use Whitewater, I use that in a broad generic sense, so that accurate information would be coming out from the White House.
But Utah Republican Orrin Hatch wanted to know just what the Clintons' concerns were over the possible appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate Whitewater.
During this January 4th meeting, did Mrs. Clinton express concerns during that meeting that an independent counsel should not be appointed?
As I recall, her concerns were, number one, that they, meaning she and her husband, had done nothing wrong. Number two, there was no predicate for the appointment of a independent or special counsel, and she was concerned about the fact that if mere allegations were sufficient, then you'd have special counsels being appointed anytime somebody raised an allegation without laying the requisite predicate.
Democrat Christopher Dodd of Connecticut concluded none of the released documents point to any wrongdoing by anyone at the White House.
Is there anything that you've seen in these documents that contradicts earlier statements or earlier evidence that this committee has received?
Not to my
Anything
knowledge.
you saw them, you and holy cowboy, this is really going to hurt us?
No, not to my knowledge. I mean, obviously people can put different interpretations and different glosses on words, but to my knowledge and from my viewpoint, the answer is no, Senator.
Well, I know we play gotcha up here a lot with witnesses to try and snare people, but I think we need to get to the bottom line.
Nevertheless, Committee Chairman Alphonse D'Amato said the delays in getting documents from the White House leave him no choice but to ask the Senate to extend the committee's hearings beyond their scheduled expiration next week.
Finally tonight, a Gergen dialogue. David Gergen, editor-at-large of U.S. News and World Report, engages Stanley Crouch, a contributing editor of the New Republic, author of The All-American Skin Game, or The Decoy of Race.
In your new book, you make an unbridled assault on what you call the politics of blame, what you also call the Afrocentric hustle. Could you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, what I'm saying in there is that I think that this is not this is not a serious discipline first. It's a fraudulent discipline, and it exists because...
The Afrocentric discipline.
Right. It's a fraudulent discipline, and it's based on some idea that you can make people feel better about themselves if you give them a glorious history. And so it doesn't matter with these people whether the scholarship is on or off, because they're functioning in a university system that has, for the last 25 years, subsidized miseducation of purportedly alienated groups, whether those groups are racial groups or sexual groups, etc. So that, you can get a job essentially teaching kids that they're alienated from everybody else in the United States.
It's not that the education is necessarily, the history may not necessarily be wrong, but it's encourage them to think of themselves as African Americans as opposed to just Americans.
As African Americans, as Indians, women who've been, who are the mules of men, right, and so on and so on. And none of which is to say that that the United States is not always attempting to purify its democratic proposition. Right. Right. But it's not in the interest of the society or the particular group for people to be fed distortions, exaggerations, Marxist-derived simplifications, tribal visions, those kinds of things. Those things get in the way.
Yeah, but they would argue, look, we did have some of our history, which we should not be denied. We don't deny us our pride. After all, we were trampled down by slavery and then by prejudice after the Civil War. There have been honest, reasons why we need to reassert ourselves. And so if we want to take on this vision of ourselves, they would argue, haven't you sold out, in effect?
Well, my argument is this. How many people know where in Europe Thomas Edison's family comes from? Mm-hmm. And there's a reason why. If you come up with the electric light, that's enough.
All right. I understand.
And so I don't really think, the Wright brothers are probably, their German name is probably Reich.
Right.
But most people don't know about that. Most people don't even know they were bicycle mechanics, because Kitty Hawk looms so powerfully over the 20th century. And with all of the extraordinary accomplishments that Afro-Americans have made in this society, and having fought in the French and Indian Wars, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, helped to win the West, fought the Civil War, were a decisive factor in the Union forces of the Civil War. Were in the cavalry, on and on, helped to start programs that foresaw what we got from the International Red Cross, etc. Built, colleges and all of this stuff, invented music, dances, affected the national humor and all of that. With all of that, to have to worry about identifying in some abstract way with a foreign continent, to me, is kind of silly.
But it's not just that. It is the politics of blame. It is to say we are the victims. We have been victimized, and therefore whatever happens in our society, we don't have to work hard because we can say, essentially lay it off on victimology.
Well, I would say that the people who promote that in a number of these university positions, that's what they're thinking about.
Right.
But I would suggest that many of the black Americans who have been successful band leaders, realtors, newspaper men, beginners of magazines, founders of institutions, etc., they wouldn't at all deny that there were difficulties.
Right.
But they also would not deny the success that they had against difficulties.
You hold out Florida A&M. Mrs. Mobley, the dean there,
right,
as an example of the way a school is a predominantly black school, business school, which has been extraordinarily successful. The way it should approach the questions of advancing people who are black.
Yeah, well, what she did was she found out what the business world wanted.
Yeah.
And she said, what do you want out of business majors? Right. And she spent 12, 15 years really developing that. For one thing, she discovered that it was good to have business majors who actually could write readable English sentences. So that put them ahead of most of the white business majors who graduate, right? They actually can write, English that other people can read. And so she systematically worked at coming up to that standard. And now Procter & Gamble and a number of people see, Florida A&M and that business school is in the top 4 or 5 in the United States because she built it like that. And she didn't, as Albert Murray has pointed out often, that if people would just approach these kids the same way athletes are approached by coaches, right? When coaches get athletes, they try to make them into champions. That's their fundamental ambition. And I think that, and intention. And I think that that's what Mobley did.
Let me come back to the kind of models and people who you would hold out as models for young blacks that they should look to, people who've risen above the question of race and have become as seen as individuals, who become individuals who've gained greatness. And tell me what it is about them that you think we should look to. Frederick Douglass.
Well, I think Frederick Douglass was a great. Well, you know, Frederick Douglass is one of Nelson Mandela's models, and I mean, he had a human vision that transcended race. I think that that's the greatness of a writer like Ralph Ellison, is that he saw, as Constance Rourke points out in her work, that Americans are part Yankee, part Negro, part Indian, part frontiersman, that we're all, that there's this mix that makes us Americans. Albert Murray calls it a mulatto culture. Right. Everybody in the world, right, no matter what we say about each other, everybody knows an American when they meet him. You know, if I change my name to Kwame something or other and put on kente cloth and this and that and jump on a plane and go to Ghana, but in 5 minutes the Ghanaians are going to go, ah, an American. If the most Negro-hating redneck guy in Boston decides that he's got to go to Dublin to get away from these darkies, right? As soon as he gets off the plane, the Irish people are going to say, ah, an American. If you put Gotti and Rudolph Giuliani on a plane across each other where they've sneered at each other all the way to Sicily, as soon as the two of them got off in Sicily, the Sicilians would say, two Americans. Now, the point I'm making is that there's something in all of us as Americans, for all of our variations, that everybody recognizes. And what I'm most interested in my work and in the All-American Skin Game, is to try to focus as much as possible on the human connections that we have and the extraordinary achievements that we've made against what I call the decoy of race.
Now, you've talked about Frederick Douglass and Ralph Ellison, Charlie Parker. You're a jazz critic, and you also talk about Charlie Parker a lot in your book, and you've written about him.
Yeah, well, Charlie Parker, I'm working on a biography of him right now. Well, he had a lot of problems, but he became an extraordinary virtuoso of the alto saxophone. In an interview, a guy was saying to him, he said, wow, Charlie, you have such extraordinary technique. Yeah. And Parker said, well, you know, I don't really think it's all that extraordinary because I used to practice 12 to 15 hours every day. In fact, they told my mother I'd have to move if I didn't stop playing. He said, it wasn't done with mirrors, not this time.
You've come down and talking about race, and you know, Martin Luther King said, don't judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their characters. Right. You had an interest, and you said it all boils down to an old Southern adage.
Oh, the one about don't worry about the color of don't worry about the color of the cow, but whether or not the milk is sour
or sweet or sour.
Right.
That's the essence of it for you.
That's it.
But you remain, after all is said and done, you have a phrase it appears continually through this book, a tragic optimist.
Right. Well, you see, I think that's the central vision in the Constitution and in our sense of government. That is that we recognize, like doctors must, right, that you are constantly going to have to deal with what I consider the four fundamental things that dog all societies. That is folly, corruption, mediocrity, and incompetence. And it doesn't matter what society you're in. And those are the things those things form the tragic fate of humanity. But we have had so many victories on so many different levels in terms of our motion towards purifying our democracy, towards realizing in our society the grandest ideas of the Enlightenment, expanding them, in fact, in such a remarkable way that every society in the world that comes to freedom ends up imitating the United States. And it ends up imitating America's documents because those are the richest vision. Those documents form the richest vision of how human beings can compromise and argue and battle their way towards fairness.
So your argument is get beyond the skin game.
Right.
Give that up.
Right.
It's fraudulent.
Right.
And move on to this higher aspiration.
Right, address your humanity. That's always there whether you like it or not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, the major stories of this Thursday. President Clinton renominated Alan Greenspan as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Budget Director Alice Rivlin and economist Lawrence Meyer were also nominated to the Fed. And the Navy ordered a temporary suspension of all flights of F-14 fighter jets after another one crashed in the Persian Gulf. We'll see you tomorrow night with Shields and Gigot and our regional commentators, among other things. I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.
Major funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lara has been provided by the Archer Daniels Midland Company, ADM, supermarket to the world. And by New York Life, yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Beekeeping and controversy over sports climbing in caves are part of the next Oregon Field Guide tonight at 8:30 here on the television stations of OPB.
Video cassettes of the NewsHour with Jim Lara are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.
Funding for the NewsHour with Jim Lara has been provided by the professional contractors of the NECA and union electricians of IBEW Local 48, working together to realize your vision for the future. And by Activate Cellular Sales. It's simple, available at major malls throughout the Northwest.
You're probably not aware that Neville Grimshaw was found dead this morning.
Next on Mystery, a recent murder with a 50-year-old clue.
Apparently he was writing about you, only now he's dead.
He says Baden wasn't a prisoner in a concentration camp at all.
Inspector Morse on Mystery.
We've been investigating the wrong attempted murder all along.
On OPB.